You're listening to Kingdom Thinking, a podcast series designed to start a conversation around the deeper intellectual questions surrounding life, faith, and meaning. Here are a collection of questions, ideas, and stories that I hope will challenge you to think about your own beliefs, and perhaps introduce you to new perspectives, regardless of where you are in your journey. I'm your host, Al Butcher, and I can't wait to share this episode with you. This episode will be all about our universe and its beginning. Does our universe require a cause or explanation for its existence? If so, what kind of cause or explanation could that be? Now, for this episode, you're going to have to forgive me, but as I'm recording this, there's actually a storm going on outside and around my house. So if you hear any sounds of thundering or rain, that's not you, that's me. Anyway, over the last 3 weeks, we've been doing something of a series on the interactions between Christianity and science. 2 weeks ago, we looked at science as a whole and examined whether or not religious belief, specifically Christianity, is incompatible with or rendered useless by scientific advance. In that episode, I argued that Christianity has its greatest power in areas that science has no hope to touch. Yes, Christianity has been used as an excuse for unscientific beliefs in the past, but the crux of Christianity rests in claims about the supernatural, which no scientific discipline can claim to study or conclude anything about. Last week, we looked at the questions surrounding design and whether the idea that our universe is fine-tuned is supported by recent advancements in modern science. We then explored whether this kind of fine-tuning required an explanation, and if so, what kinds of explanations were available. We looked at the several oft-ignored but serious metaphysical flaws underpinning New Age rejections of the God hypothesis. This week, I particularly want to address a series of arguments called the cosmological arguments, focusing on one that I believe to be the strongest and most relevant, the argument from contingency or causation. Cosmological arguments are often called first cause arguments, and for good reason, because they strongly look at the beginning of the universe or at the beginning of some kind of process. As humans, we fundamentally understand the idea of cause and effect. It's one of the first things that is taught to us. In fact, it's one of the methods most often used to teach us and others life lessons, by examining our actions and then the circumstances or behaviors that they create. It's unsurprising that the idea of causation is then so key in an enormous amount of human endeavors. For example, a pharmacist working on and testing the latest drug is always wanting to know, does this drug cause patients to get better? Or would they have done that on their own? Does it cause the negative side effects, or are those stemming from something else? In fact, both philosophers and scientists, more than anyone else, are always motivated by searching for causes. Why does something happen? Where does it happen? What affects it? Why do things turn out the way they do? For the theist, the universe can only have been caused by God. Over the course of this podcast, I'm going to make the admittedly quite large claim that the universe must have been caused, and as such requires a cause very much like the Christian God. Let me give you an example. Suppose I was wanting to investigate what is holding me up. Say that was what I was looking for. Well, as I record this, I'm sitting at my desk on my chair. So my chair is what is holding me up and preventing me from falling. But then, what's holding up my chair? The floor. And then, since my room is on the second story of my house, the frame of the house is holding up my floor, which is in turn held up by the foundation, and we see here that a chain seems to be arising. There are two possible things that can happen with this chain. Either, 1, the chain goes all the way down. Every layer is supported by another layer beneath it, and this just goes on forever. However, this explanation doesn't really make sense, as there is no reason why all of those layers wouldn't just be falling together. Or secondly, there is a layer somewhere that is a different kind of layer to all the others. A layer with different properties, made of different stuff that supports itself. The answer to the question of why that layer doesn't fall down where the others would isn't that something else is holding it up, but rather because that's the kind of stuff that this layer is made from. It supports itself. Within this analogy, it's pretty clear that it must be the second option, and indeed you'd be right. The core of the Earth is supported by its internal pressure and contains the Earth's center of gravity. It's the focal point for the gravitational force acting on me, my chair, my floor, and my house. It's the kind of thing that can hold itself up. If you take this argument and you replace the idea of stopping from falling with causing to exist, you get the general idea of where I'm going. Everything is either caused by something else, but in order for this chain to make sense, there must be something made of different stuff at some level. Let me explain what the argument entails. This argument is phrased as a set of statements followed by a conclusion. The first statement is that if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause of its beginning. The second statement is the universe began to exist. And then the conclusion is that, therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning. Quite a simple argument. First statement, if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause of its beginning. Second, the universe began to exist. So it logically follows that if both of those statements are true, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. There have been many phrasings of this kind of argument, from Aristotle all the way to modern philosophers and theorists of religion, and everyone in between. But let's go through this version in detail and see how it can be constructed and understood. The first point is that if the universe genuinely began to exist, then it has a cause of its beginning. This seems relatively obvious, but allow me to offer some points in defense of this. First, it seems ridiculous to suppose that something can genuinely come from nothing. This is actually worse than magic. At least when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, you've got both a magician and a hat. To deny that the universe requires a cause if it genuinely began to exist is to believe that it simply popped into existence out of nowhere, from nothing, and for no reason. Almost all common sense reasoning and scientific thought support this idea. In fact, the scientific method is based around the idea that things don't just happen arbitrarily and randomly, but that there are patterns and causes that we can observe. We observe this in our day-to-day life. Second, if it were possible for something to come from nothing, why on earth doesn't it just happen more often? What is it that is so special about universes that they're the only thing who can pop into existence out of nothing? Nothingness is precisely that, nothing. It wouldn't be able to choose between universes or other things. Why don't we see elephants and cars and bicycles popping into existence out of nothing? Because it's absurd. And to presume that the universe popped out of nothing in this way is similarly absurd. So I think the idea that if the universe began to exist, then it would require a cause is at least far more plausibly true than false. Note that in this section I'm not actually arguing whether or not the universe began, but simply saying that if it genuinely did begin, then it would require a cause. So I think that this first idea is at least more plausibly true than false. A refutation to this often comes from those atheists who are interested in quantum physics, who point to subatomic particles which can apparently come into being from nothing as a result of quantum decay processes. To this, I would simply say that only coming about in an accelerator, being operated in a specific way, and being transformed from one type of matter into another, with a total amount of energy being preserved, is really not quite the same thing as genuinely coming from nothing. Okay, so where have we gotten to so far? I've satisfied you that, at the very least, the first statement, if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause, is at least plausibly truer than false. The next idea is whether or not the universe actually began to exist. This has, historically, been the major point for contention around this argument, as it is by no means obvious at first glance. After all, the universe has existed for as long as any of us can remember, even longer than written records have existed, and it will most likely outlive any of us currently alive today. However, there are both philosophically and scientifically good reasons for believing that the universe has not existed forever. Philosophically, the idea of the universe having existed forever, or rather, for an infinite amount of time before now, brings with it some serious problems, as there's debate about whether an infinite number of things can actually exist. Sure, the idea of infinity is one that we can kind of grasp in our head, and it's one that we've developed some quite wonderful mathematics to be able to discuss, but that doesn't mean that an actually infinite number of things can exist in the physical world. For example, imagine two children bickering with one another as children are wont to do. The first child says to her brother, "You're stupid." The second child replies to his sister, "Oh yeah? You're stupid times 2. The first child, not to be outdone, shoots back, "Well, you're stupid times 3. And we can see where this is going. Discounting the possibility of either of the two children dying of old age, let's assume they're kept alive by sheer force of childish anger alone, they will never get to a stage where they can look back and say, "We've replied to one another an infinite amount of times." No matter how long they do it for, they will always be able to quantify in numbers how many times the other one is stupid. So therefore, you can't actually count to infinity. They will never reach an infinitieth number. But if you can't count up to infinity, how on earth can you count down from infinity? If we imagine the past as a long line of dominoes, with the very last domino representing today, right now. However, before the last domino is knocked over, the one before it must be knocked over. Before that one is knocked over, the one before that must be knocked over, and so on and so on and so on. You just keep getting driven up the chain so that no domino could ever be knocked down. Then the final domino of today could never fall if there were infinitely many dominoes before it. But here we are. Thus, the idea of the universe and time itself existing for eternity is seriously philosophically problematic. On top of this, in a way that early proponents of the cosmological argument could have only hoped for, we now have extremely strong scientific evidence for the idea that the universe has a beginning. Ideas like the expansion of the universe, discovered initially almost by accident in 1917 by Albert Einstein as he worked on his new theory of gravity, support this notion. This was then fully and properly modelled independently by Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann and Belgian astronomer Georges Lemaitre in the 1920s, finally being verified by Edwin Hubble in 1929 as he observed distant galaxies to be redshifted, meaning that they were moving away from us. This model of an expanding universe eventually came to be known as the Big Bang theory. We found that as we trace back the expansion of the universe in time, everything gets closer and closer together until eventually the distance between any 2 points in space becomes 0. And at that point in time, the boundary of space and time is reached. You cannot go any further back than that. This model implies that past time is finite and had a beginning. In fact, over the last few decades, many models have been proposed, and those that do not propose an absolute beginning have been consistently shown to be unworkable. Therefore, on the basis of these philosophical and scientific arguments, it is at the very least reasonable to believe that the universe began to exist at some point in time. Let's review. First, I argued that if the universe began to exist, then it requires a cause for its existence. And then secondly argued that the universe did, in actual fact, begin to exist. It follows from this that the universe needs some explanation for its existence. What kind of explanation would this be? What would its properties be? What kinds of things can we know about it? Well, for starters, this cause would have to exist outside of space and time, since it caused space and time, so it cannot be bound by them. This cause must itself be uncaused because an infinite series of causes is impossible. It must be powerful in a way that we cannot imagine, since it created all matter and energy in the universe. Finally, this cause must have agency. It must be personal, a mind able to make decisions. Why? Well, if the cause had always existed but didn't have a mind of its own, why did the universe only begin 14 billion years ago? Why not before? Why not after? It seems that since this cause is timeless, as it is outside time, it must have freedom of will, with the creation of the universe as a free act. Thus, just by looking at the cosmology and looking out into space, we arrive not just at a cause of the universe, but to its creator. A creator with freedom of will, who is unimaginably powerful, and is therefore more appropriately described as God. Thank you for listening to this episode of Kingdom Thinking. I release new episodes every week, so jump on the Kingdom Thinking Facebook page for notifications about episodes as they come out, as well as information about the episodes like transcripts. Until next time, have a great week and God bless.